Hi all, today we're here to talk about the various kinds of Game Boy cartridges and the various systems that will play them. We are only talking about officially released products today, so no third-party items that may or may not have worked with Game Boy cartridges. First we have the standard gray Game Boy cartridge. Notice its gray color and the small notch out of the top right of the cartridge. These will play in the majority of Nintendo handhelds that have been released. From the original Game Boy, its redesign, the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, and can actually be played on a TV through a console with the help of the Super Game Boy in the cartridge slot of a Super Nintendo, or with the GameCube's Game Boy Player. These original gray carts, however, will not work with the Game Boy Micro, nor will they work with any of the variations of the DS. These gray carts only had 4 colors to play with, which were all shades of green originally, and eventually black and white on the Game Boy Pocket. However, when played on a Super Game Boy, or on the GameCube Game Boy Player, you can select which 4 colors you'd like the game to be displayed in. You can select your own, or you can choose from several pre-existing palettes. Some cartridges were specially made to work with the Super Game Boy. Those games had this logo on them, as well as on their packaging. These games came with special borders and displayed in special color palettes, often having more than the usual 4-color limit. These games often had different color palettes for different levels, as well as for inventory screens and other events in the game. If played on the GameCube Game Boy Player, they do retain their special color palettes, however, you will not see the borders displayed. Next we have the black Game Boy cartridges. These came out after the Game Boy Color and were meant to be compatible with both the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. So they essentially have the same compatibility as standard gray Game Boy cartridges. However, when it came to the Super Game Boy, they were a mixed bag in terms of what features they had. Some fully supported the Super Game Boy with special color palettes and borders. Others did one or the other, and some, for whatever reason, did nothing at all when you stuck them in a Super Game Boy. The game would play, but just in 4 basic colors. So there you have the 3 types of cartridges that will work in an original Game Boy. We now move on to cartridges that are Game Boy cartridges but no longer work in an original Game Boy. Here is a Game Boy Color cartridge. You will notice it is different from an original Game Boy cart, first in that it is semi-transparent green plastic, and secondly that it does not have a notch out of its top right. Since it has no notch, it is impossible to put one of these cartridges into an original Game Boy and actually turn the system on. If you were to put one of these cartridges into a Super Game Boy or a Game Boy Pocket, a message will display telling you that this game is not compatible with this system. These cartridges will only work in a Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Advance SP, or in the GameCube Game Boy Player. Once again, these carts aren't compatible with the Game Boy Micro or any of the versions of the DS. The games on these carts look about like original Nintendo games, with many games in the library being NES ports or slightly enhanced NES ports. There isn't much more to be said about these carts, as they had a very short life, as only a couple years after their release, they were replaced by our next carts. The Game Boy Advance carts. You will notice that these are about half the size of our last 4 types of carts. These carts work in a Game Boy Advance, obviously. A Game Boy Advance SP are the only thing that works in a Game Boy Micro, the Nintendo DS, the DS Lite, and the GameCube Game Boy Player. They will not work in a DSi, DSi XL, or anything else for that matter. The games contained on these carts are about the level of the Super Nintendo. much of the library that's on these carts are simply ports of Super Nintendo games. And that is it for all the kinds of cartridges that went in things that carried the Game Boy name. All in all, these carts had a good run, with the original Game Boy being released in 1989, and the Game Boy Advance line being discontinued in 2008, giving the Game Boy name a run of 19 years. Longer than any other gaming device. Thank you for watching.